Well, hello, and thanks so much for joining me, and thank you also to NABS for having me. My name is Josh Roberts. I'm 30 years old, and until very recently, I worked in the advertising industry. I worked first at the Times and Sunday Times, selling ads, I should say, nothing more exciting than that. And then latterly, I was at the Financial Times. That was until January of last year, so January 2019, when, following a fairly bizarre series of circumstances, I was given the opportunity to write this, Anxious Man, Notes on a Life Lived Nervously. It's my first book. It's about, well, all sorts, but primarily it's about what it's like to go to bed as a fairly normal, I guess, 20-something, and then to wake up the next morning to really discover that your mind has collapsed. It's a book about what it's like to experience that kind of full-scale capitulation of the mental faculty, what it's like to go through that, how you go about getting better, and what are the sort of lessons that you learn and things that can help other people. What qualifies me to write a book like that? Well, pretty obviously, it's exactly what happened to me. So it was about 4 years ago now, but I went to a party, not a particularly big party, and actually I would say not even a particularly good party, but a party nonetheless. And actually I'd been quite well behaved, I suppose, sort of drunk enough to dance, but not much more than that. And so when I woke up the next morning, I was surprised, well, not only to have a hangover, but also to wake up into the most savage panic attack. Now, panic attacks are different for different people. For me, they are intensely physical things. So I really do feel anxiety, panic when I'm in the middle of one. It's the sort of normal sensations, I guess, of nervousness, but elevated to, kind of ear-cracking, ear-splitting volume. So, my heart thumps louder than I think it can, harder than I think is possible. My eyes are kind of dilated, my skin is sweaty, my breathing is short and shallow. It's like all of those sensations of doing a driving test or taking an exam or a big pitch, I guess, but kind of elevated to this really huge volume. And then kind of accompanying the physical terror during a panic attack, for me, there's a mental one as well. And it's much simpler than the physical stuff. It's very singular. For me, the only thought in my head when I'm having a panic attack is that at some point, the physical sensations in my body are going to become too much for my body to handle, and I'm going to die. People talk about panic attacks being sort of simulated dying, but for me, and I guess anyone who's experienced one of these will say the same thing. It's not simulated dying, it really is dying until the moment that you're kind of out of it. I had panic attacks before the kind of morning after, the night before, as it were. I'd had a couple of panic attacks earlier in my 20s, but I'd always slightly written them off as being, I guess, burning the candle at both ends, or a kind of normal part of being a 20-something-year-old person living in London and, going out regularly, not sleeping very much and all that kind of stuff. This panic attack, though, was very different, and it was different for really two reasons. Firstly, it was different in terms of its intensity. So I really had never experienced anything quite as terrifying. I do remember it being a full body, totally immersive experience. And the second thing was, unlike before, this panic attack lasted for a long time. The duration of it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Usually for me, when I'd experienced panic attacks earlier in my 20s, 30 seconds, maybe a minute. But this one really lasted for a number of hours, probably about 2 or 3 hours. And when it did eventually start to subside, it didn't so much subside as kind of morph. It went from being that immediate fear of dying, those immediate sensations of nervousness, to a lower level, but much more sort of all-pervasive kind of fear. And it stayed like that for, a number of years, really. As you would imagine, the morning after, having experienced this panic attack, I took myself off to A&E. In fact, I went to A&E 3 different times across 48 hours. They love me in there. And I also went to see a number of NHS GPs. The general sort of prognosis, and it's not their fault, the NHS just really isn't at the moment, sadly, equipped to deal with mental health. But the general prognosis was that it was a hangover gone wrong, and that, with enough sleep, cups of tea, episodes of Friends or whatever it was, eventually things would get better. Of course, the problem was, I didn't sleep at all. In fact, I didn't sleep for 4 days on the trot, and I wasn't eating or drinking, so cups of tea were out of the window too. Eventually, this is on the Thursday now, having started on the Sunday, I kind of just plucked up the courage, coughed up the cash, and went to see a private GP, the dad of a friend of mine. And he very quickly diagnosed me with something called generalised anxiety disorder. What's a generalised anxiety disorder? You worry involuntarily, obsessively, and pretty much all the time. There are sort of 3 broad categories of general anxiety disorder as I experience them in terms of the thoughts that I have. The first is, worries about real things. So these could be things that most people would worry about: losing your job, maybe getting dumped, getting fired, being in a car crash, or someone else being in a car crash, all those sorts of, let's call them normal worries about real things. So far so normal. What sort of crosses over into a clinical anxiety disorder is when you experience the second group of thoughts, which are worries about worry. Bear with me, because it's a little bit complicated, this, I understand that, but basically most people worry about negative things happening to them. Only people with anxiety disorders worry about those worries. So for example, very common during lockdown and in the last few months for people to worry about not being able to sleep. The thought pops into your head, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight, for example. Very common. If you struggle with an anxiety disorder, you'll have that thought, I'm not going to sleep tonight, but then your brain goes one step further and goes, and by the way, I'm never going to enjoy my life because I'll always be worrying about sleep. It's a kind of, I guess you could call it a second order derivative of the kind of original worry. So worries about worry. And then the third thing, and this is very common with anxiety disorders, but also with depressive conditions too, is thoughts or feelings associated with guilt. So, you look at it on the surface, what on earth do I have to worry about? I'm a white, middle-class, university educated, living in London man. On paper, I've got absolutely sod all to be, anxious about. And you kind of use that fact as a stick with which to beat yourself. It's very common with anxiety, but also with, like I said, depressive conditions too. So worries about worry and guilt. And these thoughts pop into your head, as I said, involuntarily, so you have no control over the thoughts that arise in your brain. And secondly, obsessively. So when I'm in an anxious phase or in an anxious period, these are the only thoughts in my head. I can't think about what to have for tea, or what t-shirt to wear, or how nice it would be to go on holiday, or whatever it is. The only thoughts in my head are worries about worry and guilt. That's kind of an anxiety side of things, but I do think it's worth poking around some of the other common mental health problems as well. Lots of people think that mental health problems exist in isolation, or at least this is how you'll hear them talk about these problems. So they'll say, she has anxiety, or he has depression, or, he struggles with bipolar, or whatever it is. In reality, it's very common to find more than one mental health problem sort of coexisting. So for me, whilst definitely the kind of lead singer of the band is anxiety, stretching the metaphor here a bit, but the other kind of backup singers have been depression. So I've experienced 2 really deep depressive phases, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, depression and anxiety make extremely common but quite odd bedfellows. And I say odd because, and again, this is just my own experience, but they are, very, very opposite, very kind of antithetical ways of being. Anxiety is a hot, frenzied, excited way of being. Excited as in, you kind of feel the sensations of excitement, even though it's a negative thing. Whereas depression is the absolute opposite of that. It's not, it's not an overwhelming amount of emotion. It's a complete lack of emotion, a complete, dearth of feeling or sensation. I describe it in the book as being like a kind of, lead dressing gown, or a damp sort of musty pillow on your face. It's just kind of like you can't function, and you don't want to function. And then obsessive compulsive disorder, almost certainly the most misunderstood, or at least misspoken about mental health problem. Whenever you develop behaviors or compulsions, physical things that you think that you have to do in order to either reduce the occurrence of thoughts in your head or sort of stop them altogether, whenever you start doing that, that's when you cross over into obsessive compulsive disorder. So for me, it's always been about sleep. By the end of it, I had probably 20, 25 different rituals, compulsions, behaviors, whatever you want to call them, things that I had to do in order to be able to sleep. So, turn out the light at a certain time, drink a certain quantity of water, get up and get back into bed at a certain time, and rah-de-rah-de-rah. And I just mention this because OCD, whilst it might have something to do with your sock drawer or, the sort of tidiness of your cutlery drawer or whatever it is, at its worst, OCD can be a really enfeebling, really pernicious disease. So I met people, again, researching for the book, I met a lady who hadn't left the house for, I think, 3 years because she was so worried about contamination fears. And I met a bloke who had to cut himself, or he felt that he had to cut himself in order to be able to sleep. So yeah, next time you hear a colleague sort of talking about, oh, I'm a bit OCD, you can remind them of this fact. It was really bad for me for about a year to 18 months. So slept very little, ate very little, worried loads, experienced 2 really deep depressive phases. And then in between all of that was rushing around, fulfilling a number of bizarre compulsions that I thought kind of relieved the thoughts in my head. Then I made some fairly fundamental, nothing too over the top, changes to the way that I live my life. And very quickly, things started to get measurably better. I'm not cured. I don't think you ever are cured of a problem like this, but I'm definitely much better at spotting when things are about to go pear-shaped and sort of taking corrective action. And what you tend to notice is that over time, what happens is the sort of periods of convulsion become smaller, shorter, and the distances between them grow longer. And eventually you get to a stage where actually you spend more time not nervous than you do spend being nervous. We'll talk about the things that I did to sort of get better in a little bit. I appreciate that's probably the most important thing, most important takeaways from this video. Not just for people like me who have the problem or have had the problem, but I'm convinced that the same things that get you out of one of these problems are the things that stop you having one in the first place. Things that help you to build resilience to mental health issues, and that's why we'll touch on those in great detail a little later. I do think it's worth, though, before we do that, just poking around a little bit about where mental health problems might come from. And it's important to do this because I think if you understand a bit more about where they might come from, not only does it help us be much more accurate when we come to curing them, but it also just helps to move the public conversation along a little bit. There are sort of two main theories, and sadly there isn't much scientific consensus on this yet, but there are sort of 2 main theories about where mental health problems might come from. The first sort of group of theories is to do with our parents, and it's fairly obvious, but either through our genes, so just as our parents pass on skin tone or hair color in their DNA, so too might they pass on obsessive or depressive or anxious genes. Not a huge amount of evidence. Rather, there's no consensus around that. But the alternative, second sort of theory within that is the idea that we learn these behaviors from observing them in our parents. So, just like you learn, to walk or body language or how to ride a bicycle, those sort of things, from watching your parents, so too could you observe anxious or depressive behavioral patterns in parents and learn it from them too in that way. Again, not a huge amount of consensus. The second sort of group of theories is, rather than these problems being inherited or observed, is to do with external factors, or environmental factors. So these are things that either we do to ourselves, booze too much, take too many drugs, don't sleep enough, stay in a job you hate, don't, rah, or things that happen to us. So, things that I'm mentioning earlier, getting fired, getting dumped, losing a loved one, being in a sort of traumatic event, and those sorts of things. As I say, there really is very little consensus within the scientific community about which is most responsible. Is it parents? Is it environmental factors? Et cetera, et cetera. I can just tell you from my own experience, I think it's a bit of both. So definitely, I think I was born predisposed to these issues. You look at my sort of family tree, there's quite a lot of, undiagnosed, because, them's were the times. But there's lots of it in my family tree. But then also the way that I behaved throughout my 20s was a recipe for disaster. And that's not to say that I had a particularly crazy time in my 20s. Sadly, particularly for the advertising industry, I would say I had a moderate to tame time in my 20s. But nevertheless, I think it was enough. You combine those two factors, enough to sort of push me over the edge. Which raises the really important question of whether or not it's possible to be born slightly predisposed, as many of us will be, work in high stress or sort of the opposite of that, kind of high, boozy environments, as lots of us do in the kind of advertising, creative services, marketing services industry. Is it possible to have those sort of characteristics and survive, to work in advertising and not end up having a mental health problem? And the good news is, of course, the answer is yes. That's what I refer to as resilience. And like I said, we'll sort of touch on that a little bit. There's a few other just things worth correcting, I think, in terms of terminology. And I'm not a big one for terminology. Try to have a very thick skin when it comes to this sort of stuff, and really, whatever you think is best, I'm happy to be as forgiving as possible. But I do think it's worth just covering off a couple of things about resilience, but also well-being. Well-being, a bit like OCD, is one of these terms that is just crazily misunderstood, and for very good reason. It's been co-opted by all sorts of corporations, campaigns, governments, whatever. Loads of different people have got different interpretations of what well-being means. Couple of things, and the way that I think about well-being. Firstly, it's a verb rather than a noun. It sounds a bit bit trite, but what do I mean by that? Well, lots of people think about well-being as something that you can buy, or something that requires, or it's like a thing, a grail, something that you can sort of ascertain if only you spend enough money, or go on enough spin classes, or drink enough green juice, or whatever it might be. And in reality, well-being is actually much simpler than that. And it's a doing word. It's a series of practices, behaviors, things that you have to do in your life, and do over a sort of concerted period of time in order to reap the benefits. So it's a verb, not a noun. And secondly, and I say this particularly to any blokes who are watching, but I appreciate the message is universal, but if you had pitched me some of the stuff that I'm about to pitch you in my sort of 20s, a lot of it I would have written off as being sort of, well-being, wellness, mumbo jumbo. And the reality is that the things we'll talk about saved my life. If I hadn't made these changes, if I hadn't started considering my well-being, I would have killed myself. That was kind of the plan. At the end of the first year, if things hadn't got better, that's where I would have ended up. And so it's not wishy-washy, it's not hippy-dippy, it's not sort of prayer circle, flower power bullshit. This is all real things that have real impact on your mental health and therefore your life. Okay, let's jump into it. What do I actually mean then? So what is well-being? Drum roll, please. It is being nice to yourself. Okay, complete mild cheddar. What on earth do I mean by that? But I really do mean, the reason I use the word nice is because it kind of sums up exactly what I mean. Well-being is not about, like I said, being superlative, being the best, being relentless, being da-da-da-da. It's about being nice to yourself, being nice to your mind and your body, but doing that for a concerted period of time. And let's jump into some of it straight away. So these are things that you can do for yourself or that you can encourage other people to do to either get you out of a mental health problem or to stop you having one in the first place. And the first thing is booze. Okay, alcohol, liquor, call it what you want to call it. Now, in the last 3 months, we have seen an explosion in alcohol sales, 30% increase in March alone in terms of retail alcohol sales, which would suggest that most people seem intent on sort of seeing through COVID with a bottle of beer or a glass of wine in their hands. There's a number of reasons why that might not be a good idea. So the first is to do with brain chemistry. So lots of people, when you ask them about alcohol and mental health, or alcohol in general, lots of people will say they think of alcohol as being either a stimulant or a depressant. So you'll hear people say things like, champagne is a sort of stimulating drink, it picks you up, it's a party drink, whereas something like whiskey or gin is a depressive drink, you know, that image of someone kind of slumped on the bar, whiskey in hand. In reality, and this is the kind of interplay with mental health, all alcohol, all ethanols are both a stimulant and a depressant. And what that means is that when we drink, the sort of stimulating forces, the release of things like endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, all those kind of happy reward chemicals in the brain, the stimulation, are matched with a depressing characteristics, so things like the function of neurotransmitters in our brain. And that's one of the reasons why we slur and why we stagger when we're pissed, is because functions in our brain are much lower. On their own, either stimulation or depression, not necessarily the end of the world, but when you put the two together, it creates imbalance, chemical imbalance in our brains. And it's one of the reasons why, for example, even if you don't have a problem with anxiety, lots of people will struggle with hangxiety or kind of hangover anxiety the morning after a big night because of that imbalance. And the second thing about alcohol and mental health is to do with sleep. So you might think, and indeed actually you'd be correct to think, that you fall asleep quicker when you're drunk. But at the same time, unfortunately, the quality of the sleep you experience is much less. So you get much less of the kind of deep, restorative, rapid eye movement sleep. And also you tend to wake up more throughout the night. So you've got bad brain chemistry anyway, and that's kind of compounded by a lack of decent sleep. The good news is I'm not suggesting that you go teetotal. I did that for 6 months until just the sheer quantity of weddings that I was going to got too much, and I ended up having to start drinking again just to get through it. But I really do recommend having some kind of rule or having some kind of North Star when it comes to alcohol. Helps you to be aware of how much you're drinking, and actually as a result of that you do tend to drink less. So for me, I try never to get a hangover. I'm allowed, I can drink whatever I like, right up to the point where I think, actually, I'm probably going to feel a bit cruddy tomorrow. And that's when I try to sort of taper things off. It's by no means a perfect science. I get it wrong all the time, particularly in the last few weeks. But I do find, as I say, that having a kind of goal in mind helps me to be mindful of how much I'm drinking and ultimately to kind of reduce it. The second kind of pillar of my recovery and of well-being and resilience in general is exercise. And, this is no great surprise, but the science and the consensus around this is so clear. The more we exercise, the lower our levels of anxiety and the higher our levels of mood. And there are tons of reasons why. The first, like with alcohol, is to do with brain chemistry. So, like I said, with booze, you get both stimulation and depression. With exercise, you just get the stimulation. You get tons of serotonin, tons of dopamine, tons of endorphins, all of those lovely chemicals that make us feel happy and rewarded. And at the same time, it's really good news for sleep. There are loads of mechanisms through that by which that sort of works. One of the ones that I find most interesting is to do with body temperature. So you may know this, but as a kind of hangover from when we were cavemen and the fire kind of dying at night, human beings tend to sleep better when our bodies are a little bit cooler. And as nighttime approaches, our bodies reduce in temperature by about 2 degrees centigrade. And exercising mimics that effect, because as we exercise, our bodies heat up, and then as we recover, they cool down. And it's one of the reasons why, if you've ever been on a sort of nice stroll through the countryside and then found yourself in a comfy chair in a pub, you feel that sort of sensation of sleep washing over you. That's exactly what's going on. There's kind of, like I said, very strong consensus, and the good news about exercise is that you don't have to do lots of it. So 3 times a week for 30 minutes a go, and try to focus on exercise that is repetitive and aerobic. So things like running, swimming, cycling, rowing have been sort of shown to be the most anxiolytic, the most effective at combating anxiety. But having said that, if you're super into weightlifting or whatever it is, whatever your poison, it's always good news. I think the other thing about exercise, and this is maybe not quite as physiological, much more psychological, is that it helps to give you a sense of control. And one of the things that people, particularly over the last few months, have been saying to me, people who haven't struggled with mental health until recently, this sense of complete lack of control over the spread of the virus, of course, but also your career, the economy, kids' schooling, all of these different factors. Everyone can feel very at sea. And it's very common with mental health problems to have the same sensations. When you're, worrying obsessively and involuntarily, you can really feel at the mercy of your condition. Exercise gives you something to do. It's a positive, something, a lever that you can pull, and it helps you to regain a sense of control. It's important, I should say, not to do it obsessively. You're not going to die if you don't go for a run this afternoon. But it has been shown to be something that's very, very powerful, and I agree with it. The third thing, and this is where, if there are people who are at all skeptical about mental health, I'd ask you just to bear with me, because this really has been a fundamental building block in the fact that I'm still alive. The third thing is to try to integrate a degree of skepticism about the thoughts in your head. What on earth is he talking about? Okay, well, until you have a mental health problem, you tend to think of the thoughts in your head as being both logical and based on evidence. So if your brain tells you, fires a thought into your brain, like, I'm no good at this job, or I'm no good at public speaking, or whatever it might be, your sort of default position is to take the thought as being based on evidence and logic, because, well, why else would you have thought it? What happens after you have a mental health problem and you sort of enter into a process of therapy is you come to realize very quickly that a huge percentage of the thoughts in your head are rubbish. There's no evidence to support them, and there is no logic behind them. They're just thoughts, just things that your brain has come up with. And understanding this and kind of being aware of this is a hugely powerful moment if you're recovering, but also if you're trying to build resilience as well. There are a number of ways that you can go about kind of introducing this skepticism, this kind of questioning mentality. Some of them are very formal. So I, for example, have been through a really long process of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT is probably the one of the only evidence-based treatments for conditions like depression and anxiety. It starts from the premise that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all tightly interconnected. So if we have a worrisome thought, that will lead to worrying feelings, worrying sensations in our bodies, and those can result in worrying behaviors or exhibiting certain behaviors. And then what happens is, because our brains see us exhibiting the behavior, we take that as evidence of the fact that the thought was true, and then it just goes round and round in a circle. Thoughts, feelings, behaviors, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and you just get worse and worse and worse. I call them kind of thought loops or anxiety cycles. And CBT starts with that premise and then suggests that what you need to do is, rather than trying to stop thoughts popping into your head, is to arrest them and challenge them with logic and evidence before they become feelings or behaviors. I said, warned you, it might sound a little bit hippy-dippy, but this is how it works. So, for example, a thought would pop into your head, I'm never going to sleep tonight. And without CBT, that would maybe lead to you feeling nervous in your body, and as a result of that, maybe you would drink a whole load of alcohol in order to get to sleep that night, or maybe you would start pacing the room, or whatever it might be. Using CBT principles, what you'd say is, okay, the thought pops into your head, I'm never going to sleep tonight, and you would challenge it with two key questions. Number one, what is the real likelihood of that outcome coming true? And secondly, what is the real severity or sort of awfulness if it does come true? And in this case, so take the sleep example. Okay, what is the real likelihood of not being able to sleep tonight? Well, actually, whilst, yeah, there definitely is a possibility that you wouldn't sleep tonight, if you were to look through the past year or so, what you'd probably find is that on most evenings you were able to sleep pretty well. In fact, probably on the overwhelming majority of evenings you were able to sleep pretty well. So maybe the likelihood of it coming true isn't as obvious as you might have thought. And secondly, what's the severity even if it does? So how many times have you had a sleepless night and then been fine the next day? Okay, a bit grouchy, maybe, itchy eyes, maybe feeling a bit puffy, whatever it might be, but you've got through it and ended up probably having a successful day. In other words, not only is it quite unlikely to come true, but also if it does, the severity isn't probably the end of the world. It starts off, CBT, being a very manual process. So you really do have to arrest thoughts and challenge them and conduct these kind of thought trials. You really do have to sort of sit down and think about it. But over time, it becomes completely automatic. And now, for example, I'm at a stage where I'm quite capable of, having a meeting or, speaking to you through the camera today, whilst also simultaneously be sort of challenging thoughts in my head. And it's a really powerful tool and a really useful thing to be aware of. The good news also is that, like I said, I've been through this very formal process of CBT. And actually, NABS, I think, do have resources available to help people when it comes to CBT. But there are also some brilliant apps that will help you to integrate this kind of way of thinking without necessarily having to go and sit in a therapist's office. Things like Headspace, things like Calm, really, really great apps that can help you in this regard. Booze less, exercise more, get skeptical about the thoughts in your head. And the final thing is the most important thing, actually. And it's something that I would just really, really underline, put in huge, Arial, bold, size 18, whatever you want. Take this home with you and please try to remember it. The most important thing when it comes to building resilience, maintaining well-being, or getting out of a mental health problem is to ask for help. Ask for help. Mental health problems, anxiety, depression, doesn't matter what it is, are cancers of the mind. The longer you leave them, the bigger they become and the harder they become to operate on. Early intervention with mental health is everything. And so the moment you feel that you're maybe lower for longer, or worrying more than you used to, or struggling to sleep, or whatever it might be, ask for help. And of course, it's much easier said than done, particularly in the current environment. So, I say this as someone who's always worked in sales teams. The very last thing you want to do is to mark yourself out as being a problem child, or to go and find yourself stigmatized because of having a mental health problem. Here's my story, and this is the reason why I think you can be confident that when you sort of go forward and ask for help, that you'll find it. Like I said, I was working in the advertising industry, and I was working in sales teams which are very meritocratic, very highly driven, performance-driven teams, and I was really worried what it would mean to come forward and ask my bosses for help. And I needn't have been. Both my bosses, both the people I told at work, were incredibly supportive, and I found that a bit surprising until I learned that 25% of us across the course of our lives will have a common mental health problem: anxiety, depression, OCD, whatever it is. 25% of us. So if you assume that everyone has at least 3 friends or knows at least 3 people, right? 100% of the population will either have had the problem themselves or know intimately someone who has. And the upshot of that is when you come forward and you ask for help, or you just tell someone that you have a problem, you very often find that you're pushing on an open door. Booze less, exercise more, try to get skeptical about the thoughts of your head and ask for help. There's a couple of other things actually. I did say that that would be the last, but there are a couple of other things, just kind of COVID specific things that I would mention, things that we can do to improve our mental health. The first is to do with routine. Now, you would have doubtless heard all manner of stuff about the importance of routine. It was one of the things that was just everywhere at the start of lockdown and stuff. But, and maybe, you have a great routine, or maybe you started with a great routine and now you've kind of let yourself go a little bit and found yourself sort of eating breakfast at 3 p.m. and staying in your pajamas, whatever it is. Here's why routine is important. Aside from exercise, the strongest area of scientific consensus with mental health is around purpose and achievement. So whenever we feel that we're achieving things, whenever we feel that we have a sense of purpose in our lives, our anxiety levels are lower, our mood is higher, and so on and so forth. And the quickest, easiest way to feel like you're achieving things and to feel that you have purpose in your life is to make a list of things that you want to achieve in a day, a routine, and then to smash about and smash through them and kind of get going with it. There's a couple of things I would add to that. So very specific things. Morning routine is particularly important. And there are physiological reasons why. Our blood sugar levels are lowest in the morning. So, we tend to be grouchier. Whenever we have low blood sugar, we tend to be grouchier. And secondly, we have highest levels of hormones like cortisol in our blood in the morning. And cortisol is a stress hormone. And if you ask lots of people, and I would say this in my own experience, if you suffer from anxiety disorders, they're always worse in the morning, and those are the reasons why. So the returns to having a routine will also be strongest in the morning. So make a routine, focus it on the morning, get up and get going. That's the first thing. And the second thing is try to be aware of, and I appreciate the audience here, this mightn't always be possible, but try to be aware of how much news and social media you're consuming. So social media, it's a complicated picture, but sort of net, the effects for mental health are pretty bad. So the more time you spend on social media, the higher the likelihood that you'll suffer from depression, the higher the likelihood that you will struggle with low self-esteem, and the higher your levels of sort of feelings of envy and jealousy. Not great if you're already sort of prone to struggling with mental health. And then with the news media, I found this really interesting. It was a study in the States found that not only does watching the news make you worry about the news, but it also amplifies pre-existing anxieties or worries. So if you were worried, for example, about your weight, watching the news would make you worry about your weight even more, even if there's nothing to do with obesity in the news. Not that you're obese, I should say. So yeah, try to manage or be aware of how much social media and how much news media you're consuming. Again, there are brilliant apps for this. I'm using something at the moment called Moment, which helps you to sort of really focus and reduce down the amount of time you're spending on news and social media. But I'd thoroughly recommend it. Booze less, exercise more, get skeptical about the thoughts in your head, ask for help, get a routine, and try to wean yourself off the black mirror. Those are sort of things that we can do for ourselves. Those are things that have helped me to get much better in terms of my own mental health. But I often get asked about helping other people, and particularly in a professional context, completely understand why that's important. And again, particularly us Brits have always been pretty bad at talking about our emotions and whatnot. And very often, rather than sort of say the wrong thing, we just choose not to say anything at all. So here are some things that you can do to help colleagues or friends, other people who you suspect might be suffering. The first thing, and this sounds a bit cliched, a bit sort of trite, but is to ask the question. Ask the question. So lots of people will say this, but it really is true. When we ask people how they are, we aren't really interested in the answer most of the time. Most of the time, how are you isn't a question, it's a piece of sort of social performance or etiquette. You just want to get to the next question, get to the meat of the conversation. If we can transition from that state of affairs to one where actually we ask questions and listen intently to the answers, that's the first stage in becoming helpful and becoming better at talking about mental health. Ask the question. The second thing, and this is really important professionally, but there is a sort of social context to it too, is if someone tells you that they have a mental health problem, or maybe not even in those terms, nothing quite that serious, but they, I'm really down in the dumps or haven't been sleeping or whatever it might be. The second important thing to do, having asked the question, is to believe the answer. And I say this because we live through really exciting times for mental health. Loads of celebrities are talking about it, lots of TV campaigns, Muppets like me being given book deals and things like that. But there is sadly a kind of countervailing force to that, and that is a degree of sort of cynicism or kind of skepticism about mental health. So you'll hear people say, for example, oh, she has depression, isn't that convenient given that it's a Friday? Or, oh, he says he needs to work from home because he has problems with anxiety. Those kinds of attitudes. There are a couple of reasons why I think you can believe someone if they tell you that they have a problem. The first is that for all the advancements, we're still in a place where mental health carries a degree of stigma, and I don't think you sort of open yourself up to that stigma unless you really do have the problem. It's the first thing. And secondly, even if there are a very small minority, and I don't doubt that there are a small minority of people making it all up or being hypochondriacs or being snowflakes or whatever you want, I think believing those people is a price worth paying for believing everyone who really does have a problem. And I would just say that, we've spent the last goodness knows how many hundreds of years erring on the side of you don't have a problem and stiff upper lip and all that sort of stuff. And it's led us to a scenario where the biggest killer of my friends, but also just men under the age of 45, is themselves. And so if we can just spend a few years erring on the side of actually maybe we'll give you a helping hand, I think it would be surprising to see that those statistics don't come down. Ask the question, listen to the answer, and believe them. The third thing, and again this is important professionally but also socially, is not to write that person off. So particularly in these kind of very tumultuous times when there's loads of things going on and plans changing every minute, pretty much the last thing you might think that you need if you're a manager, or even if you're being managed by someone, would be for that person to come forward and ask you for help with their mental health. You might think it'd be a pain in the arse. You might think that they're going to be a problem child, like I mentioned earlier, all that sort of stuff. In reality, being or having a mental health problem in no way, I really mean this, in no way precludes you from being a brilliant employee, boss, manager, whatever it is. If you look back through history, the people who've suffered with mental health problems aren't just mildly successful or mildly high achievers. Many of them are incredibly high achievers. Everyone from Winston Churchill to Taylor Swift, right, have struggled with their mental health. And we need to get to a stage where we consider it like having asthma or eczema or something like this. One of these annoying, irritating, occasionally debilitating, but also manageable problems in life. And that's where we need to get to. So ask the question, listen to the answer. Don't write them off because you never know. You might have the next sort of, I don't know if you want Winston Churchill on your planning team, but you never know, And then having kind of ascertained that someone has a problem, and now that you're sort of believing them, the thing that most Brits do is they go into meltdown about actually what on earth do you say to someone? How do you actually structure a conversation around mental health or someone else's mental health? And there's a couple of really simple rules. The first being, always have the conversation. Don't shy away from it. It's really very easy and very manageable. All you have to do is listen more than you talk, because the reason that they're asking or talking to you isn't because they want to hear your problems or about your thoughts on the problem. They just want to very often just tell you that they have an issue. And secondly, never tell an anxious person to stop worrying or a depressed person to cheer up. And aside from that, pretty much anything goes. Of course, the only other rule I would say in that regard is to not say or do anything that's belittling of the problem. And the easiest way to do that is to not reference your own sort of thoughts on it. So rather than saying, oh, you have anxiety, oh yeah, I get really nervous, I don't like flying, just shut your trap. Just shut up. That's not why they're talking to you. They're talking to you because they want to tell you about their problem rather than hearing about yours. So yeah, kind of in summary, ask the question, listen to the answer, believe them. don't write them off. You might have Winston Churchill on your planning team. And then finally, talk about it and be open to talking about it. And if we can do all that, if we can do those things for other people, and if we can do the things that I mentioned earlier for ourselves, hopefully we'll get to a stage where mental health outcomes start to improve. I think there's one final thing that I wanted to leave you with, having watched this video, and I mentioned there were some real kind of core takeaways. This is the most important one, and it's the idea that it always gets better. It always gets better. And I say this as someone who has been in my life probably as low as it's possible to go without committing suicide. I think my feet sort of grazed the bottom, as it were. And when you're in that frame of mind, and when all around you is worry or depression or obsession, it's very tempting to think that your life will be like that forever. It's very tempting to submit to it, to sort of swim down, as it were. And the fact that I'm still here, the fact that I'm able to talk to you through the magic of the web today is testament to the fact that it always gets better. It might subsequently get worse. In fact, it might subsequently get very worse. But at some point, I guarantee the clouds will break, the rain will lift, and you'll find yourself being human and being happy again. And it's always, always, always worth hanging around to experience that sensation. Thank you so much. I hope you're very well, and thanks for watching today.